"Officer, arrest him before he destroys our community's water supply." The scream echoed across my ranch just as two sheriff's cruisers rolled through the front gate. I wasn't carrying a weapon. I wasn't threatening anyone. I was standing beside a weathered steel valve that had been part of my family's ranch for nearly 40 years. HOA President Linda Mercer pointed at me like I'd committed a violent crime. "He's cutting water to hundreds of families," she shouted. "He's sabotaging HOA property." Half the neighborhood had followed the deputies onto the dirt road. Phones were already recording. I could hear people whispering. I heard he snapped. I heard he threatened the HOA. I heard he's trying to force everyone to move. None of it was true. The deputy approached calmly. "Sir, would you step away from the valve?" I nodded without arguing. Instead, I walked to my truck, opened the passenger door, and removed an old leather folder my father had carried for decades. Inside were 3 documents: the original ranch deed, the recorded water rights agreement, and a county survey that had never been challenged. The deputy studied the first page before looking back at Linda. "Ma'am," his voice was suddenly much quieter, "these records say this entire water system belongs to Mr. Holloway." Linda's confident smile disappeared, but that wasn't what shocked me. What shocked me was how desperately she tried to keep the deputy from reading the next page. At that moment, I realized this had never been about water. It was about something far more valuable. "My name is Jack Holloway. I'm 58 years old, and I've lived on Holloway Ranch for almost my entire life. Long before expensive homes covered the surrounding hills, this land belonged to my grandfather. He bought it in 1968 with money he earned repairing tractors and hauling cattle across 3 counties. There were no gated communities back then, no decorative entrances, no homeowners association telling people what color to paint their fences. Just ranches, hard work, and neighbors who settled disagreements face to face. My grandfather drilled the ranch's first deep well himself. Years later, my father expanded the system, installing stronger pumps, larger storage tanks, and the heavy steel shutoff valve that would one day place me in the middle of the biggest dispute our county had seen in years. He always told me the same thing: you can replace a fence after a storm, you can rebuild a barn after a fire, but if you lose control of your water, you lose the ranch. I never forgot those words. After retiring from 32 years as a municipal water system operator, I came home to care for the property full-time. My wife, Emily, had passed away after a long battle with cancer, and the ranch became the only place where the silence still felt familiar instead of lonely. Every apple tree she planted, every fence we repaired together, every sunrise over the pasture reminded me why this land wasn't simply an investment. It was home. Everything changed when the subdivision arrived. Developers bought the neighboring farmland one parcel at a time. Within a few years, open fields became paved streets lined with oversized homes, fountains, manicured lawns, and a private clubhouse. Then came the HOA. That's when Linda Mercer introduced herself. She smiled politely the first time we met, but her eyes weren't looking at me. They were studying my land. "What a beautiful property," she said. "It would look even better if it matched the neighborhood." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't over the following months. Linda found reasons to stop by again and again. She complained that my cattle were visible from the subdivision entrance. She suggested repainting my barn because the faded red color looked outdated. She even hinted that my old windmill made the neighborhood appear less luxurious. Every conversation ended the same way. "My ranch isn't part of the HOA," she would smile. "Maybe not today." Then she'd climb into her SUV and leave. The strange part wasn't what she said. It was how certain she sounded, as if she believed time alone would eventually make my property hers. Then something else started changing. My monthly electric bill nearly doubled. The pumps were running longer than they had for years. Water pressure around the ranch dropped without explanation. At first, I blamed aging equipment, but one afternoon I climbed the ridge overlooking the subdivision and immediately understood why my well was working so hard. A second swimming pool had been built beside the clubhouse. Decorative fountains sprayed crystal clear water into the air. Perfect green lawns stretched across the property, despite one of the driest summers our county had experienced in years. I stood there watching thousands of gallons flow through waterfalls that hadn't existed 12 months earlier. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the main water lines disappeared beneath the road, in exactly the direction of my pump house. I spent the next 7 days doing something Linda never expected. I didn't argue, I didn't call a lawyer, and I certainly didn't march into an HOA meeting demanding answers. Instead, I followed the water. After 32 years maintaining municipal water systems, I knew one simple truth. Water doesn't disappear if my pumps were working overtime. Every extra gallon had to be ending up somewhere. Every morning before sunrise, I recorded the flow meter inside the pump house. Every evening before dark, I recorded it again. I compared those numbers with everything the ranch actually used: our irrigation lines, livestock troughs, the farmhouse, even the small orchard Emily had planted years earlier. The numbers weren't just unusual, they were impossible. Some days, nearly 3 times more water left the well than the ranch could ever consume. There was only one explanation. Someone else was using it. The following Monday, I drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk, Susan Reynolds, smiled the moment she saw my last name. "Your father was one of the most organized men I've ever met," she said. "Every document he filed was perfect." "I learned from the best," I replied. She disappeared into the archives and returned almost an hour later, carrying a thick folder covered in faded county stamps. Inside was the original agreement between my father and the subdivision's developer. I'd never seen it before. The contract was remarkably simple. The developer had been allowed to purchase water from our well while the subdivision was under construction. The agreement lasted exactly 3 years when the municipal water connection became operational. The developer would disconnect from our system. There was no permanent easement, no transfer of ownership, no clause allowing future HOA boards to continue using our well. Susan searched the county database one final time. "No amendments," she said, "no extensions, no recorded easement." She looked up from her computer. "As far as the county is concerned, Mr. Holloway, your family still owns every part of that system." Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about Linda's confidence. She hadn't acted like someone who misunderstood the law. She'd acted like someone who believed nobody would ever question her. The next day, I hired a licensed surveyor. 3 days later, he handed me a certified map showing every property marker around the pump house: the well, the pumps, the underground storage tanks, the steel shutoff valve. Every inch of it sat inside my ranch. Not a single piece crossed onto HOA property. I decided to give Linda one opportunity to solve the problem peacefully. I mailed a certified letter to the HOA office. Inside were copies of the original contract, the county records, and the survey. I explained that the temporary agreement had expired years ago and gave the board 30 days to disconnect from my private water system. I even offered to meet with their engineer to help make the transition as smooth as possible. For nearly 4 weeks, I heard nothing. Then on the 26th day, a white SUV rolled slowly up my driveway. Linda stepped out, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying the same clipboard she seemed to take everywhere. She didn't greet me. She didn't thank me for the letter. Instead, she looked toward my pump house and smiled. "You know," she said, "people like you always think a piece of paper makes you powerful." I folded my arms. "It usually helps when it's a deed," she laughed. "Paperwork doesn't stop progress." Then she glanced toward the subdivision before looking back at me. "Sooner or later, every piece of land around here belongs to this community." Before I could answer, she climbed back into her SUV and drove away. 4 days later, my 30-day deadline expired. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the pump house, wrapped both hands around the old steel valve my father had installed decades earlier, and slowly began turning it closed. The valve turned with a deep metallic groan. For a brief moment, everything was perfectly still. I checked the pressure gauge one last time, locked the steel housing, wrote the exact time in my maintenance log, and took several photographs of the meter reading. If anyone questioned what I'd done, I wanted every detail documented. I had barely slipped the notebook back into my truck when my phone rang. The caller read, "Linda Mercer," I answered. "You've made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, without bothering to say hello. "I gave the board 30 days. You shut off community infrastructure." "I shut off a private water line on my private property." There was a brief silence, then her voice turned cold. "You should have listened when I told you paperwork doesn't matter. It matters to the county. It won't matter when the sheriff gets here." She hung up. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled through my front gate, followed by 3 SUVs carrying Linda, 2 HOA board members, and several maintenance workers wearing reflective safety vests. By the time I walked back toward the pump house, nearly 30 homeowners had gathered along the fence. Many of them were already recording with their phones. Linda stepped out before the deputies even closed their doors. "There he is," she shouted, pointing directly at me. "He's trying to hold this entire neighborhood hostage." One woman standing near the road gasped. I knew he was unstable. Another man shook his head. I can't believe someone would cut off water just to win an argument. None of them knew the truth. Deputy Michael Harris raised one hand, signaling everyone to stay back. Let's keep this calm, he said. Linda ignored him. He threatened hundreds of families. We need him arrested before somebody gets hurt. The deputy turned to me. Mr. Holloway? Yes, sir. Can you tell me what happened? I certainly can. I walked to my truck, opened the passenger door, and removed the same leather folder my father had carried for years. Inside were copies of the ranch deed, the original 3-year water agreement, the certified survey, the county records, the certified mail receipt, and Linda's signed delivery confirmation. I handed the folder to Deputy Harris. I've owned this well my entire life, I said quietly. So did my father, so did my grandfather. I notified the HOA in writing. I gave them 30 days to disconnect from my private system. The deputy began reading. Linda folded her arms and laughed. Those documents are ancient. They're recorded with the county, I replied. She stepped closer. They don't change reality. The deputy looked up. Ma'am, do you have documentation showing the HOA owns this water system? Linda smiled with complete confidence. Absolutely. She walked back to her SUV and returned, carrying a thick black binder stamped with the HOA logo. Without hesitation, she removed a document titled Permanent Utility Easement Agreement. There, she said proudly. That gives the HOA full legal authority. Deputy Harris placed her document beside mine and began comparing the two. The crowd watched in complete silence. I noticed his eyes pause on the final page. Then mine did too. There, beneath my father's printed name, was a signature at first glance. It looked convincing, but the date beneath it made my blood run cold. The agreement claimed my father had signed it on October 18. I didn't need a calendar. I knew exactly where I had been that day, standing beside his grave. I looked directly at Deputy Harris. Before you decide who owns that water, I said quietly. There's one date I think you should check. He frowned. What date? I pointed to the signature line. My father died 6 months before he supposedly signed that agreement. The deputy's expression changed instantly, and for the first time that morning, Linda Mercer stopped smiling. Deputy Harris stared at the easement for several long seconds before looking back at me. You said your father passed away 6 months before this was signed? Yes, sir. Without another word, he asked for my father's death certificate. I walked back to my truck and handed him a certified copy I kept with the rest of our family records. My father had always believed important documents belonged together. The deputy compared the dates. April 12, then October 18. He slowly exhaled. Dispatch, he said into his radio. Contact the county recorder's office and send a detective to Holloway Ranch. We may have a forged property document. The crowd fell silent. Just moments earlier, everyone had expected to watch me leave in handcuffs. Now every phone camera had turned toward Linda. She forced a smile. This has to be some clerical mistake. Our attorney handled all of those documents. Deputy Harris nodded politely. Then I'm sure your attorney will be able to explain it. While we waited, another deputy walked toward the pump house. A few minutes later, he called us over. Mr. Holloway, have you been working on this lock recently? I looked down. Fresh scratches covered the steel housing around the padlock. Someone had tried to force it open. I haven't touched it since this morning, I replied. The deputy examined the marks. They're fresh. Linda immediately interrupted. They've probably been there for years. Before the deputy could respond, one of the HOA maintenance workers quietly lowered his head. His name tag read Eric. The deputy noticed. Sir, did you come onto this property before today? Eric hesitated. Linda shot him a sharp look. He swallowed hard. We were here Friday afternoon. The deputy looked up. For what purpose? Eric took a deep breath. Mrs. Mercer wanted us to see if we could reopen the valve before Mr. Holloway noticed. Several residents gasped. Linda spun toward him. That's not what I said. Eric didn't look at her. She said, if we got the water running before anyone checked the paperwork, nobody would ask questions. No one in the crowd spoke. The confidence Linda had carried onto the ranch disappeared in an instant. About 20 minutes later, Detective Sarah Collins arrived with a county investigator. She reviewed both sets of documents without saying much. Then she asked Linda a simple question. Can you tell me where this easement came from? Our HOA records. Who placed it there? I don't know. Who verified it? Our former property manager. The detective wrote something in her notebook. A few minutes later, her phone rang. She listened quietly before thanking the caller. Then she looked directly at Linda. The county recorder's office has no record of this easement. Linda said nothing. The recording number printed on your document belongs to an agricultural tax filing from another property. The detective paused. And there's something else. The county investigator opened another folder filled with utility reports and billing summaries. We've confirmed the original 3-year agreement expired 6 years ago. I nodded. I figured as much. But according to these records, he continued, the HOA continued drawing water from Holloway Ranch long after the agreement ended. One homeowner raised his hand. We've been paying a water infrastructure fee every month. The investigator looked around the crowd. That's exactly what concerns us. He held up one of the financial reports. If the HOA never owned this water system, why has every homeowner been paying for it? For the second time that morning, complete silence settled over the ranch. Only this time, no one was looking at me. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Linda Mercer. Less than a month after deputies first arrived at my ranch, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse. This time, nobody came expecting another speech from Linda Mercer. They came looking for answers. Every chair was filled long before the meeting started. Homeowners lined the walls, some holding years of HOA invoices, others quietly talking among themselves. The same people who had once believed I was stealing their water now wanted to know why they'd been paying for a system the HOA might never have owned. Linda stood behind the podium, wearing the same confident smile she'd worn at my ranch. It didn't last. Detective Sarah Collins walked to the front of the room carrying several thick binders. Without raising her voice, she connected a laptop to the projector. The first image appeared on the screen. The original 3-year water agreement signed by my father and the subdivision's developer. Next came the county records confirming that no permanent easement had ever been filed. Then the forged easement Linda had handed Deputy Harris. Finally, page after page of HOA financial statements filled the screen. Every month, homeowners had been charged a private water infrastructure fee. The detective clicked to the next slide. Payments totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars had been transferred to a company called Mercer Utility Services. The owner of that company was Linda's younger brother. A wave of disbelief swept through the room. One homeowner slowly stood up, holding a stack of invoices. I've paid this fee every single month for 8 years, he said, if the HOA didn't own the water system. What exactly was I paying for? No one answered. Then Detective Collins pressed the spacebar one final time, the room filled with audio from Deputy Harris's body camera. Linda's voice echoed through the speakers. Once he's arrested, open the valve before anyone checks the paperwork. No explanation could erase those words. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. One board member quietly removed his nameplate from the table. I resign. A second followed, then a third. Within minutes, the entire HOA board had stepped down. The county later announced criminal charges related to the forged easement, filing a false police report, and financial misconduct. Civil lawsuits from several homeowners soon followed. As for me, I never wanted revenge. I only wanted what my father had spent his life protecting a few weeks later. The newly elected HOA board drove out to the ranch. There were no threats, no clipboards, no cameras. Only an apology. They admitted the community had trusted the wrong people. I agreed to provide a temporary water supply while the subdivision completed its permanent connection to the county system. This time, every gallon was measured, every payment was documented. Every contract was public. Months later, I stood beside the same weathered steel valve my father had installed decades earlier. Across the valley, the subdivision looked different. The fountains still flowed, but now from their own legal water supply. The old sign reading Private HOA Water System had been removed. In its place stood a simple county marker identifying the municipal connection. Back at the ranch, Emily's apple trees were beginning to bloom again. I rested my hand on the old valve and looked across the pasture. My father used to tell me that water always finds the path it was meant to follow. I smiled. So does the truth. Sometimes it moves slowly. Sometimes people try to block it, but in the end it always finds its way home.